So I'm now going to pass it over to Aureen Zara, Assistant Curator at the museum and one of the curators for the Paper Routes Women to Watch 2020 exhibition. Hi, Aureen. Oh, you're muted. You're muted.
I'm muted, yes.
There you go.
It's hard to go back and forth. Thank you, Carolyn, and hello everyone who has joined us today. We're excited to hear from another one of our Paper Routes Women to Watch 2020 artists, Jen Aitken, who is based in Toronto, Canada. Many of you know that the Women to Watch exhibition series began in 2008, in which we collaborate with our outreach committees based in the States and also internationally, as well as consulting curators in their region to select artists working in a certain theme. So for Paper Routes, the theme is artists working creatively in paper. The number of participating committees and the scope of the exhibition has grown and expanded since 2008, so we're super excited about that. For Paper Routes, we have 22 participating committees. We have 12 national and 10 international, I believe, and one artist selected from each of those regions, so 22 artists in Paper Routes, which is our largest and most ambitious Women to Watch exhibition to date. So really an incredible growth of this program. So our committee based in Toronto is one of our newest committees. So thank you, Robin Young, Alexandra Lambert, and the rest of the committee, as well as our consulting curators who were at the Art Gallery of Ontario for all of your support and participation of Women to Watch. I had a chance firsthand to see how vibrant and dynamic the contemporary art scene is in Toronto very recently. And so it's so great to be able to see an example of that in the work of Jen Aitken. Jen makes sculptures and drawings from her observations of her surroundings and the built environment. She aims to have this paradox of ambiguity and clarity in her work, which I'll let her talk about a little bit more in just a minute. For Paper Routes, Jen is planning to create some site-specific installations, paper installations and paper sculptures, which means that she's responding to the architectural quirks of Nimois's gallery. So, and if you've been to Nimois, you know that we've got quite a few architectural quirks. Jen received her MFA in 2014 from the University of Guelph and her BFA in 2010 from Emily Carr University in Vancouver. She has received grants from the Toronto Arts Council, the Ontario Arts Council, and the Canada Council for the Arts. She's had many recent solo shows, two-person shows, and group exhibitions. She's represented by Georgia Sherman Gallery in Toronto. So Jen, handing it off to you now.
Thanks, Aureen. Thank you both for inviting me, and I think this is a great idea while the show was being postponed. I'm going to talk about a few different projects today, and hopefully it'll give you a bit of a sense of what I do overall. And I do work with paper, but I also work with a lot of other materials. So I'm going to show some recent work and then also some older work that'll relate more to what I'm going to be making for Paper Routes. I'm just going to share my screen here. So I'm going to start with this body of work that I made last year. This is in cast concrete, and I've been making concrete sculpture for several years now, and the forms have evolved quite a bit, but the general strategy and material interest has been consistent. So all the works in this series are two separate concrete components stacked one on top of one another. And very broadly, I think this project for me, and kind of what's an arc through my whole practice, is this process of finding shapes. And as Aureen was saying, there's a kind of filtering of the built environment that I think of as happening. Trying to come up with forms that look almost familiar, but you can't ever quite name them. Like there's this sort of a tip of the tongue feeling that's happening. So the process of finding shapes that I'm talking about happens for me within the strict grid that I've made up for myself, where everything that happens in one of these forms is limited to increments of 45 degrees and then these circular arcs. So every corner is either a 45 or a 90 or a 135. And then the curves are sort of placed and oriented on these same axes. And I think these rules sound pretty strict to some people, but I've always just liked to have a structure that I can kind of push against. And then it's also really been a productive way for me to kind of improve my understanding of three-dimensional space. So when I started out several years ago, the idea of thinking all the way around an object was so daunting that by breaking up that kind of infinite space into these like segments or chunks, I could start to kind of organize them and kind of find my way through a form. And then with every body of work that I've done, I've kind of allowed that grid to get more and more complicated. And so it's really over time improved my kind of understanding and manipulation of space. And then within that process, there's a number of things that I think about that kind of determine what the shapes that I want are. And so one thing that's become more and more important is the idea of negative space. And so here, especially in this piece, you can really see the kind of negative voids that are carved up by these solid volumes are just as important or just as prominent as the solid concrete masses. And then maybe the most important thing for me is this feeling that a piece changes from one view to the next. So there's the idea that you have to walk around a work to understand it. So my feeling of space is sort of daunting, and the process of slowly trying to understand it, I think I'm maybe trying to put the viewer through that too. So this, from this side of this piece, you can't necessarily predict what you're going to see on the other side. So that was the other view of that piece. And I think it's hard to give a sense of this transition in photos because you're just seeing these two disjointed, isolated views. You know, in person, there'd be a kind of transition progression of one thing, but it kind of gives you a sense of how a form can seem very rational, but also like unknowable. And then for each body of work, I develop sort of a new vocabulary of shapes. So even though I'm working within the same 45 and 90 degree parameters, and I've been doing that for quite a while, you know, a piece from this series from 2019 next to a piece from something from 2015, I think they would look sort of like they're speaking different languages. And I do sort of think of them almost linguistically, these works, like in an abstract way, like, you know, there's a sort of series of consistent shapes that get repeated and varied, and they play off one another. And in a group like this, you can kind of see them giving a sense of meaning to one another. But even though there's no actual identifiable meaning you can hook into. And then I'm also going to include some process photos. Carolyn mentioned there's been a lot of audience questions about process. So, and also the process behind these concrete works actually sort of illustrates my coming to work with paper also. So for every one of these concrete sculptures, there's like many of these full-scale paper models. So it's a process of starting with a model and kind of like cutting it up, adding to it, changing it, and revising until something finally is working for me. And then it's also a back and forth working with digital models and real paper models. And I think I probably have like thousands of these digital models at this point. And often when I'm starting a new piece, I'll kind of go back to an older digital model that I never ended up using and start working from there. And then here, for instance, is a final paper model that I really have decided on. And then once this is set, then I will start building the mold. And so that's that piece cast in concrete. And the casting process then starts by designing a mold. So this is the digital rendering, and then I cut out all the pieces. And here is an actual mold built in sort of plywood with some foam pieces that support, that are kind of ribs for these black plastic curves. That's what gives those really smooth curves in the pieces. And then I'll fill it with concrete, and then once it's cured, start just stripping away all the material from the final object. So this is that piece that I just showed, of, you know, pulling all that stuff away. And then here it is, complete, but just in two components, and then that one on the left stacks on top of this piece here. And then shifting projects here, now we are back to 2015 in my studio. And I'm noticing that so much of my studio time is spent building these paper models, and I start getting interested in them just for their own properties, not as purely a means to an end. and kind of asking like, can I turn this into its own project? And I'm starting to put them on the wall and noticing that they're doing a lot more on the wall than on the floor. And I think it's because they can really interact with the architecture and start to depend on the architecture and kind of, you know, become more sort of embedded into it. And then at the same time I'm doing this, I'm also looking around. So I mentioned this idea earlier of like filtering the built environment, and it never really feels like there's a direct line between something I'm seeing and something I'm making. But sometimes in hindsight, I can sort of notice certain things that came up that really must have taken root in my visual brain and kind of worked out from there. And this thing definitely became one of those things. I think it's funny for one thing, but like it has this very weird particular identity. It's like so specific, and yet it came into being purely as an adaptation to this awkward space. So it's like nested into these stairs, very particularly, holding up this railing. You know, there's these like little spaces within spaces within spaces. And you know, it's like highlighting how awkward this space is to begin with, but in a kind of celebratory way. And then I think all of this was really, without knowing it, like filtering into what I was trying to do with this exhibition, also in 2015. And this is my first site-specific paper installation, and similar to what I'm going to be making for Paper Roots. And it's like I'm starting with the idea of a paper model and then kind of opening it up and integrating it into this architecture. This is a gallery that was in a Victorian home in Ontario. So it's like one of those paper models, but that's either kind of been unfolded or left unfinished and containing negative spaces, you know, creating this sort of nook under the window and like folding in and around the blinds that are here. And creating a shallow space, like by wrapping around the molding, the frame of the window. And then I've also added these drawn elements into each piece. So they work as a kind of what I think of as like a bridge between the paper and between the wall. The drawing doesn't differentiate between the surface of the wall and the surface of the paper form. It just kind of snakes through space all on its own. So it's equalizing them in a way. And then the paper in that way becomes more embedded into the architecture rather than just being stuck onto it. The drawing is kind of like tape or glue that's like fusing it into that space. And there's also a more ambiguous sense of scale with this work, which I think is true of all my work, but particularly these paper forms seem a lot like a scale model, like small scale models of buildings, while at the same time being integrated into like the one-to-one scale of this actual building they're in. And this one was really, in a way, the most site-specific of the group, I think because it really changed your perspective of this center wall here. So the idea was like, normally you enter a space like this, you see three spaces. There's like a living room, a hallway, and whatever, this dining room or whatever it would be here. But three separated spaces. But then this purple sculpture is wrapping around the center wall in a way that reframes it as an object. So rather than the edge of three spaces, you're seeing an object in the center of the total space. You become more aware of like this, the whole room with this pillar in the middle of it. And then from there, I wanted to work to merge that strategy, you know, like folded paper planes, kind of talking to architecture, then with the materiality of those concrete sculptures. So these ones are made with paper mache mixed in with a little bit of concrete. So they appear to have the surface of concrete, but then without any mass. And the way they're made is just by pressing the material, which is like a kind of a thick paste, into the same kind of molds I was using for those concrete sculptures. And then there's just a thin layer of that material all over the mold, and then the molds are removed and I get these thin shells. And the molds are actually improvised for the first time. So there's no designing ahead of time. There's no paper models. So they have this kind of looseness that I really liked. And they're not site specific in this way, in the same way that those other works were, but they are talking to architecture and they have a kind of quality of having adapted to something. You know, they're really pointing to the molds they were made in, which are absent. I think you really get the sense that each one is like a structure or was a structure for something that's not here anymore. You can't quite place what that function might have been, but they seem to be calling about to something else. And now jumping forward a little bit again, this concrete piece is from the same body of work that I showed at the beginning from last year. And I had the idea that I wanted to see what one of the forms would look like at a much larger scale. Like a lot of people kept telling me they looked, like I was saying, like small buildings or something. And I thought this one in particular, what I wanted to know what it would feel like to walk under this bridge sort of overhang. And so this is a large paper version of that concrete piece. And then I thought by making it in paper, I could reverse that relationship between the paper model and the finalized sculpture. So here, actually, the concrete form is the model for the paper form. And it was made specifically for this room at Georgia Sherman Projects in Toronto, scaled like to just give you just enough room to walk around it and under it. I think my head came to just that bottom edge of this overhang. And it's hard to see in the photos because, you know, these photos are showing, like, the photos are scaled to the same size on your screen, but in real life, it was like two completely different experiences of what, like, ostensibly is the same form. Even just as an example, like the proportions, even though they were exactly the same, this top part felt way skinnier for some reason than it did on the concrete form. This had more like volume somehow. And this now is my most recent body of work from last fall. And I'm again dealing with two cast concrete forms in relation to one another, except now there are no curves and it's all just the 45 and 90 degrees. And I'm trying to kind of create a sense of a dynamic torque feeling just by like rotating rectangles in space. And I'm also now adding these steel components, as well as ceramic inlaid tiles that just add a little surface interruption. And the most drastic change for me, I think, was to figure out a problem of balance that I was having. So up until now, as I said, the components of each of these concrete pieces were just one stacked on top of another. And then as my forms got more and more complex, I started having to put steel pins on the inside of the forms to secure them, because some of them were like just barely on the edge of tipping over. They didn't quite, but it was like a security measure. And as a rule, I really don't like concealed structure. I want the structure of any piece to be part of the work and to be visible. So last year I figured out finally, it was a big victory, that I could cast bolts into the components, each concrete component horizontally. So there's a bolt that's been cast into each of these objects, and then they sort of go through the plate, a steel plate on the outside, and get bolted to the plate. So the whole thing now acts as one solid structure. And then it can become a visual element as well as a structural solution. So this plate that, you know, on that side overhangs actually a little bit and gives you that kind of thin edge, just like a little extra negative space, like offsetting, and that one plane just offsetting the bulkiness of the rest of the form. And this, and all of that work, that series is made while I was on residency in LA. And I was seeing these anchor plates in buildings everywhere. And it's like maybe the only instance where I can draw a direct line between something I'm seeing and like an actual solution for my work. But these are, I think they're for earthquake protection, like to just stabilize the wall in case of an earthquake. And sometimes it was just random like this, and then sometimes it would be, you know, integrated into like as a detail of the building. So yeah, so for this piece, for instance, in the front, like the bolts would be in this gray part on the right and then go through the orange one and then bolted to this plate, which kind of wraps around like a, you know, like a contained sort of sandwich. And then the weight of each of those components is pulling away from one another, you know, in a kind of like balance that anchors the whole thing as in the center. And I also want to mention briefly the relationship between drawing and sculpture for me. I do make drawings also, never as like preliminary drawings for sculptures, but more as a kind of abstract way to kind of feel out a vocabulary or new shapes. And these are made last spring. They're made of soldered wire, And they're three-dimensional structures, but I still think of them as drawings. And I won't say too much about them, but more in the context of like how they led to the forms of this new concrete work. And it's a material I'd never worked with before, and the idea of a three-dimensional drawing was new to me, and it kind of led to a different way I could think about space. And so each composition of these drawings, they're about maybe like 18, 20 inches box, like protruding from the wall. And they change as you walk around them. So this is all the same piece. And they really shift as you move. So from here, then I started this series of concrete works by imagining those wire drawings as kind of outlines for new forms. Like how, you know, the question, how can I fill in those voids with the solid volume and still retain that feeling of like floating rectangles in space? And part of the answer was to start incorporating these flat steel planes. So now I can have a hollow container that echoes the forms of the solid volume and then also integrates this like chunky mass onto the wall. I think without this, like this would, the concrete part would be very awkward to stuck on the wall. And so that this top portion almost seems, you know, there's a movement to it. Like it almost seems like it's been pried away from that bottom form, even though the shape is like similar, but not literal. And then that's the other side of this piece. And this is the ceramic tile again, just kind of like a little punctuation mark almost. And yeah, I'll just finish on this installation shot. This is the show in LA last year. And yeah, I'd love to answer any questions that have come up.
Thank you, Jen. That was wonderful, and love seeing all of those architectural shots of both Toronto and LA, the kind of places that you were working with. So I'd like to kind of start there and ask you about your interest in the built environment and architecture. And just, you know, do you have an architectural background as part of your art training, or did your interest in, you know, in the built environment come from living in an urban and metropolitan city like Toronto?
Yeah, thanks. I don't have a background in architecture, and I think my interest is definitely more from a kind of, growing up in a city in a built environment, but a kind of organizing of space, like more of an experiential kind of like psychogeographical kind of interest than I'm more interested in like being inside a building than the designer of a building, if that makes sense, and how it feels on a human scale.
And what kind of spaces are you drawn to? The ones that you showed have these really kind of quirky kind of design elements. Do you go out looking for certain types of spaces? What kinds of exterior and interior spaces are you like attracted to for your work?
I think it shifts. I mean, for a long time I was like really looking a lot at brutalist architecture, both at the kind of alienating feeling and then these sort of quiet moments of stillness that really get overlooked in the critique of brutalism. It can be really like human and intimate. I think now I feel really drawn to open sort of wireframe structures like railings or almost like armature, you know, like I'm thinking about those wire drawings that I was just showing. I think right now my focus is on sort of structure as drawing, or the relationship between armature and drawing as sculpture.
Paulette asked a really interesting question about your relation with time, especially as we look at your concrete works, which take time to set, versus paper, which is a medium that is more immediate in a sense. Can you elaborate a little bit on the temporality in your process?
Yeah, the paper, I mean, drawing especially for me is like a relief from that slow time. Like it is a way to kind of just get something out really quickly. You know, you don't have to deal with the pragmatic concerns of making an object, which requires more time. But I think even just being an artist at all, you have a different relationship to time. Like making art and looking at art it sort of happens and unfolds at a different pace, not just a different pace, but like a pace that is in conflict with the pace of social life or economic, like the pace of the economy. Basically, we're like constantly working against that. And that can be very delicate to maintain. But I mean, there's even a temporal, like making a site-specific work is a temporary thing, and there's a value in that. And I don't have a succinct answer. This is such a big question. But there's something interesting to me in the concrete work, knowing that it'll be around for a very long time. And even seeing something now that I made 7 years ago and having a different reaction to it and noticing something different, or, you know, or it changing in the elements outside over time. You know, what is that thing going to look like in 50 years, in 100 years? And there's a value in that maybe is particular to our work.
Yeah, definitely. There's this sense of ephemerality with your site-specific works because they will be broken down, and of course, this long-lasting idea with something like concrete. I read in an interview, and I'll just gotta get a quote, in an interview about your thoughts about the medium of concrete. You said that you find concrete ridiculous and absurd, as well as practical. So can you elaborate on that a little bit? And also in that sense, how would you describe paper? Like, what is your relationship with paper?
I think I meant ridiculous and absurd because of the mass. And it was like the most work I could give to myself. I think I have like an anxious relationship to, like I find validation in labor. And if something takes a lot of work, then I have a relationship of meaning to it. Even just the other day, I was like moving concrete sculptures around to photograph them, and I have been on the floor for a day since then. Like the labor is hard. And so that part is sort of absurd. But then the practicality is that you just can buy it at the hardware store. It's like relatively inexpensive. It's very easy to work with, casting it. And then it sort of demands all this, you know, creating, which it's just like the infrastructure that it takes around it is very strenuous. And then the paper is practical in a similar way that you can just do it, but also absurd that there's still a lot of effort and investment and like the kind of creative energy that goes into a site-specific piece and all of that innovation, and then it just sort of like fleeting, you know, and then it just disappears.
And we're getting a couple of questions about your site-specific piece for Nîmois that you're planning to make, which we know is a kind of a continuation of the Lines and Planes series that you showed us in your presentation a few minutes ago. Can you talk a little bit about the works that you're creating for Nîmois? How might it be different from, how might your process be a little bit different from what you have already done? Just a little bit an elaboration on that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think, I mean, the work I showed was about 5 years ago. So I think my sensibility has shifted since then. I think, like I'm thinking less about, I think it'll be even more about the space. Thinking more about each structure as a kind of drawing. And I think those works in the images were very kind of still contained objects. And now I'm trying to kind of work to sort of stretch thin, you know, like how long of a span can something, like how long can something span across a room, and you can still read it as a thing, as opposed to a wall. Like how long and thin can something be and still maintain its identity as an object. I think each one will still be I think, as we were talking, there's going to be 3 distinct pieces in that room. But how sort of diffuse can they get before you lose them all together? Like kind of more and more embedded is how I'm thinking.
Yeah, when you, Ginny, my co-curator and I, we were discussing the pieces that you showed in Lines and Flames here are pretty much set on the floor. And the ones for our space, you were thinking of kind of almost a ceiling or some kind of arch that connected a wall to a column. So are you kind of thinking about going out into space above the floor towards the ceiling? I mean, is that sort of how you're progressing when you think about this kind of series? Different ways to explore space.
There was a piece I did after that series that I showed that was sort of more up, there was this space in Toronto where there was a lot going on in the ceiling. Like there's all these rafters, and so I kind of find that I will just sort of go into a space and fixate on what maybe can, where is there a detail, where is there density that I can kind of start and work out from. So that, yeah, the space that I've seen pictures of, I haven't actually been there yet, but the space between the column and the wall seemed interesting to me. Like, I somehow to really play that up. Yeah, maybe perhaps like a miniature bridge sort of structure, just to call attention to that space, or maybe the column gets eaten into the wall a bit more, and the bottom of it would just feel like a foot or something. But to try to reframe the architecture a bit, like to call something out that you didn't even notice was there.
Yeah, can you talk a little bit more about your idea about exploring the relationship between the human body and these works? That these works somehow sort of embody the relationship between the human form, movement, our perception, and the sculptures themselves.
Mm-hmm. I think that's where the idea of ambiguity comes in for me. You were mentioning at the beginning, it's like ambiguity versus clarity. And I think what I want to do always is try to like short circuit what you take for granted. And like most of us move through the world and don't think about our bodies or think about how space is acting on our bodies. Whereas it's like completely directing you in every movement you make without you knowing it. And to do something that you're not used to having to do in a gallery, there's an opportunity to like become aware of that process. So for instance, all of my, like when I put a work low to the ground, like it's not coming to you, it's asking you to come to it. So, often people will sort of crouch or lean or like, and that's kind of an activity you're not necessarily even, you're aware of having to move into it to look at it. And so the same, if something is bridging a space between the column and the wall, like even if you don't necessarily have to crouch to go under it, if it's closer, the ceiling is closer to you than what you are expecting, you just sort of, it's like that jolt of like, oh, am I going to hit my head like that? It's like a flash of a inner body experience.
Yeah, and also the experience of viewing your work is with the whole body and not just with your eyes, which I think is really interesting. So the visitor is actually interacting not only with your work, but with the architecture of the gallery space itself, which is really fascinating. Carolyn, you said you had a question?
I do have a question. So I was wondering, kind of going off this, human interaction with architecture and space and kind of rediscovering dead space or something, those kind of areas we don't typically pay attention to. I wonder how your view on your work has changed recently with the pandemic and social distancing and us being very more aware of needing to be more aware of our space and, hiding inside or something, interacting. I'm so interested with, what you're interested in doing at the museum, knowing we had to make sure there's enough space, physical space for people. So I wonder if you thought about that much in your process or how you want, people to interact with architecture and space and this weird time of us having to do that.
Yeah, I can't say that I've thought much about it in terms of my work exactly, because there hasn't since then been an opportunity to show it in person. But I have definitely noticed moving through the city, looking at space slightly differently, finding like there are certain spots where I would go and sit and think or something, and that we're always, that, you know, like that would always be my spot, but now there are other people there because everyone is just sort of looking for spots to be like, you know, and so all of these dead spaces that people didn't pay attention to before now are kind of a hot commodity. Look, like even, you know, I was going out for coffee the other day, and it was like a process of like looking for, oh, where can we sit? Like it was like raining, we needed an overhang. There's a certain stoop. It was like, okay, here, no, that's someone's yard. No, where, like, oh, maybe this dead spot. This is a good dead spot because it's in a school and school is closed. We can sit here, we won't be bothered. Like, yeah, I think the way people look at infrastructure really is shifting.
What role does color and texture play in your overall body of work?
Color, I think, it came up as a way to sort of separate components. So whether it's like the purple piece that I was showing against that wall, because it wrapped all the way around the wall, it really needed a really bright color to read as a total piece. So the way I was just talking about how much can something kind of stretch and span and still have a coherent identity as one thing, like color helps to really unify one structure. And then also to separate, like in a concrete sculpture, the two components, if they're slightly different colors, will be kind of merged into one total thing, but still remain like separate objects. And texture I use, like especially with concrete, the textures of the molds are, you know, I have the smooth plastic or a rough plywood or some other things, and I will mix them, you know, like put one surface beside another in order to kind of change your reading of the form. So often I don't think I ever said this before, but I think of the wood surfaces as a kind of external shell surface to a form, and then the smooth plastic surface as if it's been cut into, like it's like slicing into something. So it gives it a kind of sense of inside outside within a shape.
Yeah, and going along with that, just thinking about your work process, these paper models that you make, does your final concrete sculpture divert from that? Do you stay true to the forms that you come up with in your paper models? Are the paper models ever considered, you know, finished works in and of themselves? Like, how do you think about those paper models in the larger process of making your work?
They get pretty abused in the process, so they're really trash by the end of it. The paper models are purely for practical reasons. So I will like mark them up and say, this needs to be the surface, this side is the surface. I use them when I'm installing a show of concrete pieces. So rather than like dragging concrete around the room, like I can kind of set up the layout of a show with the paper models and then go from there. In terms of casting, it's definitely, nothing changes after. Once the paper model is set, then that's how I build the mold. There are not surprises in that way.
Yeah, I love the idea of exhibiting the paper models as well, because it shows the labor and insight into your process. And it's not, some artists like that sort of effortless look that you're kind of hiding all the labor that it took into making that finished product. And some artists really love to show the labor itself. And I think that gives, showing those paper models and showing how the concrete came to be gives really nice sort of insight into how you think and conceive of these works. So
I think what attracted me to the
go ahead.
paper installation strategy. It was like this, because yeah, there is, and that's part of what I was noticing about the models that I wanted to like harness and turn in, you know, like it's like, how do I turn this into a thing in itself? Like to me, the model isn't quite enough, but then the paper installation is like, yeah, every time you cut an edge and tape another piece on, it's like tracking this history of decisions or labor, and it's like collecting all this energy in the object, but in a way the concrete doesn't show because it's just cast and done and there's no show in the hand. Yeah.
And what about these drawings that you have created that you call drawings? So they're more, you said they're wire kind of
Wire drawings.
Wire drawings. So do they fall, are those works in and of themselves? Do they fall in a process of something else? How do you conceive of these?
So those are works in and of themselves. The kind of things that came up for me, like the sort of images and visuals that came up, led to other things, but those are finished works in and of themselves. And that was really, and I think they're kind of the beginning of like a new strategy for me, a way of working, like those I did last year. And then since then, like one of the things that happened while I was working in LA was joining a welding class. And so moving, like upgrading from soldering to welding. So now I can try that with like thicker rods and like flat bars that have a bit of a plane to it, like just expanding on this, the sculptural tradition really of drawing in space.
Yeah, I mean, I would love to see those in person because from the image they look so two-dimensional. And then when you said that they were 3D and that there were these wire drawings, I was so intrigued because you can't tell that from a reproduction or in a slide presentation. So it'd be really interesting to see those based directly in person. I think this is a great place to conclude. Thank you so much, Jen, for talking to us today, for giving us this wonderful background into your body of work, into your process. Thanks again to the Canada Committee, one of our new committees, to all the committees for all of your support for the Women to Watch initiative. And Carolyn, just handing it off to you to conclude.
Yes, thank you so much, Jen. I'll just echo what Aureen said for taking the time to show us your amazing work and process. I think one of my favorites was seeing the small concrete that you made into the giant paper. And I mean, I can imagine the concrete one's heavier than the giant paper one. Like that, it's wild having it so big. So I just think that was just so exciting to see. And again, I also want to see the wire drawings because I thought they were drawings and then you flipped it around. It was great. So thank you again. From hearing from you directly and getting to experience your work really, brightens up this current world that we're living in. So we thank you so much for taking the time. And we can't wait to see it in person at the museum.
October 8th is when I forgot to say, the show is slated to open on Thursday, October 8th. And we hope everything is in a place, the world is in a place where people can come